Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sermon Time. I know I missed last week, which is why you're gonna get more than what you usually get this time. I'm gonna record 3 episodes back to back and then upload them. Since I need one for today, and then I had missed 2 because I was meaning to catch up on the one I missed on Palm Sunday, and then one that I missed for last Sunday. A lot going on, getting sidetracked, and for these, I can't just. It's not like a stream or something silly, or you just pop it on and go and just start talking about random whatever. These kind of have to be planned out. They're kind of important. Have to be sort of written or structured in some way. And I do have that. I got 3. Well, I got one that's actually written out, and then the others that are just kind of structured. So, with this one, we're going to start with one of the discussions. So I believe what we're going to go here is just the side notes discussion. So what's a side note discussion? Well, the other discussion episode that I did, which was on Genesis. Did I do the Exodus one already? I don't think I did. Because I'm going to hit the discussion one after this should be Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. As I'm reading through that. Though I haven't finished Numbers yet. But I got enough for a discussion. Because I'm just discussing these, unpacking them, delving into all the, the nitty-gritty, weird stuff and, context and things behind what was written, why it was written, maybe sometimes how it was written, and all that good stuff. Because we're not called to be ignorant. We're called to serve God and serve the Lord. Knowing all these things doesn't change my faith. Knowing how some things may not be real, may never have even existed, does not change my faith. Well, most things. If I had irrefutable proof that there was no God or anything, then yeah, that's a different story. But something like, a good chunk of the books of the Bible just never happened. That doesn't really affect it at all. It doesn't, because my faith is deeper than that. Mainly because, I've experienced some things. Some crazy things. Some unexplainable things. That and, man, Jesus is just cool, That's kind of how that one goes. There's something about Christ. There's something about all this. But some people, if you're thrown into a tailspin because one word of the Bible turns out not to be true, or you find out something was mistranslated, or something you were taught was wrong, and that sends you into a crisis of faith, your faith was not very strong to begin with. You didn't actually believe in any of these things. I've learned so much in such a short amount of time, and it's hard to process. It takes a while, which is another reason these episodes haven't been coming out on time, because when you're dealing with pain and medical issues and other things, all while trying to process all this information and in a way that I can then keep preaching, it makes it's a little difficult. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we just have wrong. We just have completely 100% wrong. There's stuff that we still don't understand, and that's okay. That doesn't change Christ's message. That doesn't change really any of it. And it shouldn't, because his actual message is there. And if we're really going to talk about this, and people want to know, I might do that in another episode, talk about why I still believe, why I preach and all that. But the Bible isn't perfect. It's just a compilation. No one book of the Bible, no one word is perfect. But it is a compilation. It's a source. But the Lord does speak through it. And you got to read it with him, because there's a lot of stuff you got to cut through to get to the actual good in it, because there's a lot of bad, there's a lot of just wrong, a lot of evil, like condoning slavery. That's a thing. That's evil, and we know it is. But you have to understand the context and the time in which something was written and why something was said and what these people believed. And when you do that, you can break it down, you can deconstruct it, and from there you can get the good. From there you can get the good message. Because even some of these messages that aren't great, you can get something good out of it. You can understand why a people who may have been in a desperate time did something and believed something, and then why later in the book they changed because they understood, hey, this was bad. This was not a good thing. So that's why deconstruction is never a bad thing. I only think anything's a bad thing if it caused someone to lose their faith. But even then, they didn't lose their faith. One, their faith was never strong to begin with, but they didn't lose their faith because anything God did or anything that the book did. They did it because people made them lose their faith, because they were treated so poorly that they stopped believing in God, that the hate of other people outweighed any love that they felt from the Lord, and that they won't be judged for that, but the people who made them feel that way will be judged. There will be a reckoning at some point in time, even though it might look a little bit different than what we thought or what we think, the way we were taught. But let's get this show on the road. So, this is a pretty good start, even though this is the last note that I wrote, because I just wrote it recently. But it ties into what I was just talking about, and that is, how, we got things wrong and misinterpreted things, so on and so forth. But you have Ezekiel chapter 20, 21 through 26. It explains how God gave the Israelites laws that he knew were wrong. He knew were wrong and that they couldn't live up to on purpose, so that they would forever be impure and unclean in order to punish them. This was for their rebellion, because they rebelled against them and didn't keep his Sabbaths and so on and so forth. The full would be, if I back up here to read it, if we go NIV, but the children rebelled against me. They did not follow my decrees. They were not careful to keep my laws, of which I said the person who obeys them will live by them, and they desecrated my Sabbath. So I said I would pour out my wrath on them and spend my anger against them in the wilderness. But I withheld my hand, and for the sake of my name I did what would keep it from being profaned in the eyes of the nations in whose sight I had brought them out. Even though in Exodus, and then, or not just in Exodus, but in like Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, pretty much all the Moses narrative, it's Moses who made him do it. It's just an interesting thing. And it says, also with uplifted hand I swore to them in the wilderness that I would disperse them among the nations and scattered them through the countries, because they had not obeyed my laws, but had neglected my decrees and desecrated my Sabbaths, and their eyes lusted after their parents' idols. So I gave them other statutes that were not good, and laws in which they could not live. I defiled them through their gifts, the sacrifice of every firstborn, that I might fill them with horror, so they would know that I am the Lord. So it also talks about the sacrifice of firstborn, which is something very interesting, and a lot of people don't want to talk about, both Christian and Jewish and even Muslim. Muslims are kind of battling their own battles, and some other battles, in terms of what they... Hey, would you imagine, just like every religion, especially ones dealing with Abrahamic religions, they also have their different sects and denominations of beliefs. Almost like that's how it works. I don't know why we would think they'd be any different. But yeah, right there, that says that there are laws. It doesn't say which ones. It says there are laws that were given by God that he did knowingly. Gave them knowing that they were wrong and that they couldn't keep them. Which is very important. He didn't just say that they couldn't keep them, couldn't live by it, because that would just be, I just gave you something that was too hard on purpose, knowing you would fail. He did that as well, but on top of that, he gave ones that are wrong, ones that, assumingly, he doesn't even believe in. He just did it so they would fail, so they would fight, so they'd be punished because they rebelled against him. Now, which laws are those? I don't know. Probably, well, he does mention the child sacrifice thing. Well, God doesn't command you to sacrifice your child. Yes, he does. But even at the time, that was very, very, very not great. Though there's not a whole lot of... Because there's like the cult of Moloch and all that. But even there's not a whole lot of evidence that suggests that this happened. Now, child sacrifice was a thing that happened. Human sacrifice was a thing that happened. There's these other places where we can find it in other areas. But specifically in the Bible, when it talks about the cult of Moloch and even Baal and certain places, including Gehenna, which we're going to get on that later, we don't have any evidence. We've excavated it. There's nothing there. We found other places where there's child sacrifice, but not these. And it might have been something that was immediately rejected, which even reading the text you can see. It says, you give all firstborn to God. though some can be redeemed. However, when it talks about all firstborn being given to God, it doesn't. It's not until later in Exodus it says they can be redeemed, but doesn't tell you how they can be redeemed. That comes in later text, and then says they can be redeemed this way. And then you can also redeem certain other animals, unclean ones. But if they're not, if they are clean ones, and they was like the lamb and then a bull and a few other ones, they can't be redeemed. They have to be sacrificed. But the children can be redeemed. You have to actually pay the priest. I think it's 5 shekels of silver. I think it's like 61 USD. If we went by the price of silver when I did all that research, because it fluctuates. But that, or you could give them up to the priesthood. That was another thing. Or what the text says is you would actually sacrifice them. And then you can even go back into Genesis with Abraham's trying to sacrifice Isaac because God's saying to do that. And Abraham just like, I guess I got to do it. There's talk of why this may have happened, not just here, but why this was a thing that a lot of cultures did. And it could have been because they were desensitized. Because this it's hard to understand just how good we have things nowadays. Child mortality was insane. Used to be insane. It's still at unacceptable levels in the United States, but it used to be like every other kid was dead. So you were used to these and then there was also the fact that the mother could also die, and that was a real bad thing. I mean, it was all bad. It's all terrible, but like you would lose not just your child, but your wife, your spouse. That'd be terrible. Well, so many dead kids, you kind of just get used to it. And there's even when it talks about the census taking and numbers, it says you have to wait till they're over a month old, and that has to do with child mortality rates. If it makes it a month, it's probably pretty good, but within that 30-day period, they could die. There's a good chance that they might die for one reason or the other. So when you're desensitized to that, you don't see it the same way. But there were people who did, or at the very least, maybe those feelings didn't kick in till after. Then again, these sacrifices are being done by the males, by the father, who don't have that motherly bond almost built into your DNA. Doesn't mean that fathers can't love or have that bond, so on and so forth. But when you actually create something and it comes out of your body, you tend to have some kind of attachment to it. Not everybody, but usually you do. I mean, there's people who, when they have surgeries and have things removed, just regular things, they have an attachment to it. It's like, oh, that thing that was a part of me is gone. That feels weird. That was me. And, it's because it was a part of you. There is an innate bond there. Of course, the bond with a mother and child is much stronger than that, than if you get like a tooth pulled. But it's still something of yours. Well, with the fathers, the people who would be doing the sacrificing, they probably don't have that, probably because they're expecting them to die. Now, if every child is seen like a gift because every other one is dying, why would you sacrifice them? Well, if you thought that sacrificing a child, especially one that might die anyway, die in a few hours, few days, you sacrificed them anyway, and that would give you a chance at having more children who wouldn't die. So that would bless you and your family and your lineage. That was a better chance to take. The idea is the odds were better doing that than just keeping the firstborn and them dying anyway. The idea is you're probably going to lose that kid either way. At least this way you could, since you believe that God is staring at you, watching you, and going to either bless or curse you, that this way he would bless you and then bless the rest of your children. The rest of your lineage and legacy, and you would have more kids. Yeah, that's kind of backwards to think, but when you're desensitized to death because it's happening, it's inescapable. Back then, I've always talked about, like, you got a headache back then, you got diarrhea, you were dead. Well, it was even worse than that when it came to childbirth. It was just awful. And you get desensitized to it, to a point, because you've just been traumatized. And trauma Trauma really influences most of this scripture. Uh, just of the hard times that they went through. And one of the reasons they just, even the ones who don't like slavery are just like, oh, whatever, it's slavery. That just, it is what it is. It taking them so long to realize that they could speak out against it. And even for the longest time, that being a minority position in early Christianity, and even in Judaism, there were people who were against it, who were vehemently against it, but they were a minority, just because you had, of course, the people in power are like, it is what it is. Kind of like it is now. But then later, many, mainstream big abolitionists, whether through nonviolent or violent, were Christians and Jews and Muslims. So even though the Abrahamic religions did condone slavery, out of them came people who were against it, using their scripture to fight against it, using the love of God to fight against it, because slavery is wrong, and they knew that from a loving God. You could not have slavery. And the reason it was condoned is because they just saw that is what it is. Well, something is the way that it is only because you let it be. And if you have the ability to change it, you can change it. We have that power. My sermon about how together we can do everything, talking about the Tower of Babel, that's a good one. But yes, going all the way back, even Ezekiel says that there were laws given that he knew were wrong. Which ones? I don't know. You have to come. So I always like to think back to that one when we're talking about, you can't change this, you can't go against that, blah, 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 when it comes to the laws. One, these were laws written by men, not God. And many of them, even though they make you think that they're really old. I mean, they are. They're thousands of years old, but they're not that old. They're not as old as they say they are, because the Torah didn't get compiled until much later. It didn't get written down and compiled until the Babylonian exile. I have that here. One of these pages, because I was writing about that. Babylonian exile, where you at? 5th century BC to 2nd century BC. It was written over a period of about 500 years. That's when it was compiled. The Babylonian exile did not last 500 years. Babylonian exile lasted, which is when a lot of the Exodus narrative was written. A lot of this, because when you read that, the Exodus and Leviticus and all that, there is no archaeological evidence for this mass exodus. And just numbers-wise, it's not possible. It's definitely not possible for it to have happened like it did, and the Egyptians were able to ignore it, because it would have devastated that country with the amount of people that would have lived, especially during the time that it said. But I've discussed before that something like that, there were little small exodus that happened, but they didn't have anyone named Moses. But there could have been something that happened with the Hyksos when they were driven out of Egypt because they weren't good. But that happened way before we think the time of Moses would have been. But that could have happened, and then those stories got passed down. And passed down, mixed with other stories, and then when you go thousands of years later to the Babylonian exile, which would have been 598 BC to 538 BC. That's how long it lasted. And a lot of that was being compiled and put together. They needed a narrative that supported, that gave people hope and wanted them to rise up. And this exodus of God freeing them from an oppressor. Even though the Hyksos were the oppressors in Egypt. And it's not that there wasn't some persecution. It's not that Egypt was always the good guy. That's not what that means. And there were small exoduses that happened, but nothing on the level of the Bible, except for that Hyksos one, where they were driven out when the Egyptians rose up against them. And that makes sense because there were also large famines that happened, which Genesis talks about, and so on and so forth. So they would take all these stories and just mold them into what they need, because they were being oppressed at the time. They were in an exile. There was a conquest. Their temple had been destroyed, King Solomon's temple, and all this. And they needed hope. They needed something, so they needed a story about that. So they pretty much changed their oral traditions to fix that, which is nothing new. That's kind of something that's always happened. It's just this was also the first time they were writing stuff down. It's also why, after the stories of Moses, no one really mentions Moses anymore, despite him being incredibly important, and despite him being mentioned in the New Testament. But there's a lot of the Old Testament doesn't mention a lot of these figures that you think they would. And that's because they probably didn't know about them. They probably hadn't been formed yet. If they did have an Exodus story, it was very different than the one we have now. If they had Moses at all, he probably wasn't called Moses. It might have been called something else because it changed so much. I mean, King David likely didn't know who Moses was. Now, there's mention of Moses in the Psalms, but that's if King David wrote those Psalms, because out of the 150, he only is attributed to have written 73 of them, and of those 73, we don't know how many of those he actually wrote. So there's that's the fun part. But you have these grand historical figures that aren't popping up anywhere, and you would think would be popping up in other historical references. There's more references to King David, earlier references, than there's anything of Moses. First reference to Moses would have been 326 BC. And that's your earliest Greek references to Moses, because it comes from the Jewish people. Because, Greek and Roman taking over the land of Judea, all that good stuff. Well, not good stuff, but, history. It's fun. But that's the earliest one we got of Moses. Earliest one we have of King David would be... where'd I write that? I wish I was doing this in order of how I wrote this. This would be so much simpler to do. But I wrote all this down. That's why we're doing this side notes one. Oh yeah, so the Tel Dan Stele, which is dated to around 870 BC, is the oldest reference to David. And it mentions the house of David. And the oldest reference to Israel is, the Merneptah Stele, dated 1208 BC. But the stories go back way before that. That's just the way that it is. So, let's see here. There's also the Mesha Stele, or Moabit stone, dated to 840 BC, and references a battle with the house of David that's closely referenced in the Bible, though varies. But it mentions the house of David. So at that point in time, at least in those people in Judah at the time, they were known as the house of David. So we have references to David around, though it still would have been a good while after he died, because he would have been 9th or 10th century. He would have been before that, so he's probably dead. But they were still known as the house of David. Now, whether the actual David resembles anything of what the biblical David looks like, don't know. But we know that there was a King David. That name got thrown around. So that existed. And these references are not too long after he was around. He still would have been dead. But it's not too long, 840 BC and 870 BC, not too long after he would have reigned. And they were still known as the house of David. So your whole country is still known as the house of David. They knew about you. So there was something there. But no references of Moses until hundreds of years later in 326 BC. And you think they would have, not just because of what he did, but because of how central of a figure he is in Judaism. If we want to talk about Jesus, there's all kinds of references to Jesus. I mean, everybody wants to look for references in this time, and there are some. There's also ones by Jewish historians, and then you get all kinds of references to him later, even less than 100 years later, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, a lot of that's by the people worshiping him, but you have reference to him outside of the Bible. People around the world who have come in contact with these Christians know about Jesus because they're talking about him and always talking about Jesus. They're like, yeah, I know this Jesus guy. I don't know anything about him, but they like him. That's where your references come from. But for whatever reason, the Jewish people didn't seem to be talking about Moses for that long because his name was either different or it's the story itself was completely different, or it got made up much later, or there's all kinds of weirdness about it. That's one of the reasons why later stories seem to not even acknowledge not just Moses but the Mosaic law. Like when King David, breaks several commandments at the same time: coveting another man's wife, adultery, lying, murder. And then when he is called out for it, they don't mention the law. They don't mention the Mosaic law. He gives him a story about a rich man and his sheep stealing from a poor man, stealing a sheep from a poor man or whatever. And David gets mad about him, and Mad's like, I'll take out that rich man. And the guy goes, I'm talking about you. Instead of going, yeah, there's these 10 commandments, right? It's like, they're kind of a big deal. May not have had them, or may not have had them the way that we do. Another fun fact about the 10 Commandments: there's different 10 Commandments. One, they weren't called the 10 Commandments. Not until recently. That's another fun thing. The 10 Sayings, or the Decalogue. And then they started calling them the 10 Commandments because it sounded cooler. That's not even really an exaggeration. They just kind of went with it. It's like, oh, that sounds good. Let me get here, because this particular Bible has the different sets. Now, they still say the same things. They're just a different order. So you got most Jewish traditions, the Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, and Protestant churches, and then Roman Catholic and Lutheran churches. 3 different groups, right? We have different 10 Commandments. So, let's see here. What is an easy way to read this? So there's the divine self-identification in Exodus 20, chapter 20, verse 2. It says, I am the Lord thy God. That's considered commandment 1 by both the Jewish tradition and Catholics. But by Protestants and Orthodox and Anglicans, that's just considered a prologue. We haven't got to the first commandment yet. Then commandment 2 in Jewish traditions is about worshiping other gods, and then they also consider the idols to be part of not worshiping or not having idols as part of the second commandment. Whereas the Protestants, we'll just call them Protestants, consider the first commandment to be worship no other gods but me, and then the idol commandment of not having idols to be a completely separate commandment, that being commandment number 2. And then the Catholics and the Lutherans consider the self-identification, the commandment against worshiping other gods, and the commandment against having idols to all be the same commandment, which is interesting. And then the Protestants and the Jewish traditions follow the exact same. After that discrepancy, once they get to commandment 3, the divine name, and I believe blasphemy and taking name in vain, all of that is the same. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are all the same, because there's 2 different versions of, or there's coveting can be split into 2 parts. 17a and 17b, verse 17a and 17b. Whereas the Catholics, they consider, of course they put 3 commandments and made it all into one. Then the divine name is number 2. Then the Sabbath is 3. One about parents is 4. Murder is 5. Adultery is 6. Theft is 7. Perjury is 8. So lying. And then coveting is number 9 and also number 10, because they split that into 2 separate ones. So yeah, just a little fun fact. People don't realize it, that we have different 10 commandments depending on who you're talking to. All the commandments are still there. So it's not that they're different. They're just numbered differently. Or some are actually considered as part of one commandment, or others may be split up into multiple. It's very strange. I actually kind of agree with the prologue being separated and not being considered the first commandment, because he's not commanding anything there. He's just saying, I'm the Lord thy God. That is it's a proclamation. An identification. Who am I? This is what I am. This is what I do. Then after that, he gets into the second one. Everyone else just wants to make it simple. I'm like, it's all the same thing, even though that's not a commandment. He's just saying, if someone says hi to you and then gives you a rule, you don't consider that hello as part of their rule. That it makes sense to separate those two. All right, where were we now? As on to my side notes. These are actual notes that I have when I do research, because I've been going book by book, and then I was researching some other things. So I'm like, I can't just mix this in with my numbers research. So I will have to do a side notes section. And then I have a lot here. Oh, another fun one. So, the Bible never commands women to cover their body. I know you've always been told, every denomination, even Catholics, everybody, women got to cover up. Can't be showing the breastises. Can't be doing that. Definitely can't be doing it. God forbid. Definitely can't show ankles or shoulders. Men will just lose their minds. All that stuff, right? People that wear the ankle length skirts and all that, especially Pentecostalism. It's crazy. Yeah, that's not in the Bible. There's no command that says women need to cover up. Nothing that says they need to cover their body to avoid lust from men. In terms of New Testament, Paul mentions that women need to cover their hair, head, and face while praying and prophesying. And then kind of changes his mind on that. He has some weird hat rules, because he also talks about men wearing hats, and then like in the middle of having this argument just kind of says it doesn't matter. It's very strange. But that's the only one. And by the way, other fun fact on that, in terms of wearing veils and covering up their face, hair, and head, one, it's supposed to be, it's circumstantial, so it's not all the time, just while praying or prophesying. But this particular rule here is why in the Middle East women cover up their heads. So requiring face and head covering is a Christian thing, not a Muslim thing, even though it's the Muslims that do it all the time. This is where this comes from. It's from Paul's teaching. That's a weird one. How like it's a Christian teaching, but it's almost never practiced in Christianity, but for somehow jumped into a completely different religion. Very, very strange. But that's where that comes from. Now, when Jesus talks about lusting after women, he puts that blame squarely on the men who are lusting, holding them responsible and accountable for their own thoughts and actions. He never commands women to cover their bodies. He just commands men to stop being so stupid. Stop acting out on that. He says it's your fault if you're looking. It's your fault if you're acting on it. It's not the fault of the person. We can tie this back to King David. It wasn't that woman's fault she was taking a bath. It was the king's fault for being creepy and watching her take a bath and then deciding, I'm just going to take her. Oh, no, she's pregnant. I guess I'll have to kill her husband. like, you don't put any blame on the woman for that. So all this victim blaming stuff, not in the Bible. And there are some Old Testament commands about what women should wear, especially when it comes to makeup, especially when it comes to makeup and jewelry. It has nothing to do with modesty in terms of covering up and lust. It's modesty. There's nothing wrong with modesty if that's your choice. But in terms of that modesty, it's talking about showing off your wealth, being gaudy, and being like, oh, look at me, look at my gold, look at my silver, look at my bands and my earrings and my expensive makeup and perfumes. I mean, you think cologne and perfume's expensive now? Well, back then, just out of this world. It's unheard of. You're doing all that, that's trying to show off your wealth, which was detestable then, and even more detestable in the New Testament. You weren't supposed to do that. You weren't supposed to show off like that. You're supposed to use that wealth to help others and each other. You weren't supposed to just show off. Oh, look at me, look at me, look at me. God did not like that. God is never like that. If you're going to look at anybody, you're supposed to be looking at God. And any wealth that's supposed to be shown is supposed to be shown towards God, not for you. You're not supposed to be shown like that. And even not just with showing off wealth that way, but even showing wealth in like the priesthood. So be like, oh, look at me, look how holy I am, all that. God does not want that. Doesn't want you showing off that way. But in terms of being naked, doesn't care. Probably should put something on if you live in the desert. Otherwise, you will burn to a crisp. That's just me. That kind of makes sense, right? But pretty sure women walked topless a lot back then in that area. and we know that tribes in Africa did, and some still do, and also the Native Americans and stuff. You know why? It's because it's hot outside. Now, you would cover up, and we didn't always have the technology or the ability to weave open fabrics that could cover up but let the air go through and keep you cool. Because you do want to keep you from burning, but, you know, it's also hot. So the same reason guys take their shirts off when it's hot, women were doing the same thing, and nobody cared. That wasn't a sin. The sin was trying to rape someone because you thought they were hot. That was a problem. The sin is not them being naked. Now, there was a thing about touching your naked body parts on certain things and how that can make you unclean, how you weren't supposed to touch altars and stuff with your nakedness. So specifically talking about genitals, because God is a germaphobe in the Old Testament, or for a lot of the Old Testament. And really weird thing about the dead. Death is seen as the ultimate impurity. And there's all these rules you got to follow if you're even near anyone that died, even if you see them in a field and such, which is going to become a problem, a real big problem once they start going to war, because you can't just banish people for a week. It can't, like, after every battle, otherwise you're going to run out of soldiers real fast. But yeah, there's nothing about women covering up. So if a woman wearing revealing clothing is too much for you, it's too much for you. Stop looking. Have some self-control. They're not sinning. You are. So what else we got here? I might split this up into multiple because I have a lot of side notes here, and they're all just kind of random. Some of them track with similar trains of thought. Some of them don't. Let's see. That's probably a good one to end on. So Christian holidays, including Easter and Christmas, are not pagan. I know we've all been told that. And there's a reason for this. And it's kind of a sinister reason. Wouldn't you believe it? This has to do with the Nazis. And then also German white supremacists before the Nazis. So there was a big push for paganism to be accepted. Now, what is paganism? Paganism is a catch-all word. Pretty much anything that isn't Catholic is pagan. So technically, Protestants are pagan. Jews are pagan. Muslims are pagan, even though we all worship the same God. Anything that is not Catholic is pagan because they're the ones that got to decide. But in this, they're talking about old Eastern European religions and gods that they may or may not have worshipped. It turns out a lot of these gods may not have even existed and were made up by folklorists who wanted to sell books. Some things made up in the Grimm's fairy tales. There are some things that we only have names of but don't actually know about how they were actually worshipped. Specifically, like in Germany, in the the Germanic area, we just don't have a lot. But there was an effort, even before the Nazis came into power, and then one during it, to distance themselves from Christianity because they saw Christianity as impure, as not German. They wanted a German religion. They wanted, let's go to our roots. Let's go to more German, not this icky Christian religion. And it didn't have anything to do with the Romans, oddly enough. It had to do with the fact that it comes from the Middle East. And, there's a lot of, basically, them icky brown people. We can't be having them. And that's an awful sentence that I hate to say, but that was the truth because they were white supremacists, and that's what they thought. And then even when the Nazis adopted Christianity, they didn't want it to be Christian. They wanted to create a German religion, and they were going to use Christianity as their basis. Hitler was not a Christian. Hitler was really into the occult and a lot of other stuff, but there were a lot of Christians in Germany, and he needed the votes and needed to stay in power, so he couldn't alienate them. He could give them scapegoats and people to hate, but he couldn't completely alienate them. He did turn on the Catholics eventually, but he couldn't completely alienate Christians. But what he could do is use that, build upon it, and turn it into something else, to where the religion is only Christianity in name, is more of a national religion, a religion of Germany, a religion of the nation, which is more about worshiping the nation with just some Christian stuff on it. Similar to kind of what the Romans did to Christianity by just adopting Christianity and then making it Roman, just as Roman as they could be. And a lot of the problems we have today with Christianity are because of the Romans. And it also sounds similar today with oh, would you look at it? The white supremacy movement of today, and the Christian nationalists and such, who do everything but actually worship and follow the teachings of Jesus. Turns out we've been dealing with this problem for a lot longer than you would think. Oh, excuse me. It's an issue. But let's talk about Easter. So Easter is not pagan. Oh, what about the Spring Festival? Blah blah blah. All kinds of cultures have different festivals, and have different and have similar holidays around similar times. It doesn't mean that it was stolen from one another. I don't understand how Christianity is the only one that gets accused of stealing certain things. Oh, well, they have a similar festival over here, and the Christians have it, so they must have stole it. Look, I understand Christianity has a bad rap and did a lot of bad stuff. The Catholic Church sucks. That's like, we get that, right? Just like any big movement that wants to maintain its power does a lot of evil. That's just what they did. But if this religion over here has a spring festival, and then this other religion literally down the road has a very similar spring festival, almost one-to-one, how come they're not accused of stealing? But the Christian religion, who has a spring festival that's not even close to being what these other ones were, that may not even have happened, or were being practiced, but it's not even close, that one gets accused. So Easter, by the way, did steal from somebody, if you want to call it stealing. But it has nothing to do with paganism, or at least not Germanic paganism. It has to do with Judaism, which technically is paganism because it's not Catholic. But has to do with Judaism, because in most of the world, Easter's not called Easter, it's called Passover. Passage. Sometimes Resurrection Day in some other places. But it's Passover because it's the same holiday. Because people forget that Christianity, before it split off into its own thing, was just a different sect of Judaism. They were Jews. That's who they were. They were just Jews that also welcomed in Gentiles and didn't really have a conversion process. And it took them a while to figure some things out. But then once they did, they wanted to be their own separate thing. That's a whole other can of worms. But it's Passover. It's a renegotiation of Passover. That's why Lent lasts though we separated into several different things, and instead of just celebrating the whole thing as Passover, but Lent is part of it. That's why Lent lasts so long and has its traditions. But it's called Passover in most of the world. Why is it called Easter here and in Europe? Well, in a lot of places in Europe. It's because when it finally got there, specifically in that German area, which, by the way, it had already been practiced by Christians for a very long time before it even got there. But when it got there, the locals started calling it Easter, or rather, Oster or Easter, based off the month, because they called their months different things back then. And this month of when Easter started occurring, even though in modern day Easter can occur in 2 different months, either March or April, but around this time it was occurring in Oster, or Easter, which was named after, we believe, a goddess, either Ostra or Astra. We don't really have a lot of information on this probable goddess. We just know there was a month named after her. Similar to how even our months, the modern months, have their names based off of leaders. Why even down to why some have longer, why some months or have more days than others. Or even our days of the week. What Thursday's Thor's Day, so that's Nordic, and then Wednesday is Odin. It's Friday from Freya. I don't remember, but it's got a lot of those Nordic names. It's just how that worked out, right? But they started calling it because of the month. They didn't start calling it because they assimilated these other traditions or these other people. Now, that does happen, though assimilation may not be the right word to use. Just when some people do come from other religion, even willingly. Not everybody who joined Christianity was forced, but willingly, who just joined it, start adding their stuff to it, and they're sometimes allowed. When they are assimilated, they usually aren't, or that forced assimilation, they're not allowed to bring their stuff over. They're used, that's seen as ungodly, and so you have to understand, because it's very important. Not because we don't want Christianity to look bad. It's because it's important to differentiate these things so you don't lessen the evils of certain things. It's why when we talk about slavery, I don't want everything. When people just use slavery, they use that one word. Doesn't mean that slavery in general isn't evil. But when we talk about slavery, we need to be real careful about how we talk about it, and how African slavery and what we did was completely freaking different than what happened in other parts of the world. And usually your traditional forms of slavery, especially indentured servitude, which is not the same thing. Now, chattel slavery was practiced thousands of years ago as well, and there are places that did it just as bad as what we did in the African slave trade. But words mean things, and words were used to demonize and dehumanize the slaves, and just calling them the slaves and not even considering them people. Same how when people talk about black people, and they'll just say like blacks, which is don't say that. Some people are just old and they may not mean it, but that's dehumanizing them. They're black people. They just they have black skin or dark skin. It's not even really black. It's dark skin, but they're people. They're human. You don't dehumanizing them. When we put everything in a big bowl and generalize it, it takes away from the awfulness and the horrible things that were done to them. So don't do that. So when we talk about slavery in the Bible, which is still wrong, there were different forms of it being practiced, and most of it was way different than what happened to Africans. That needs to be understood. Otherwise, you lessen what we did, what multiple countries did, but including America did. You lessen what we did. Like, oh, well, they did that in the Bible days too. Not the same thing. Most of it was not the same thing. Still bad what they did. Not the same thing. And it's when people generalize, it's them trying to basically shed responsibility. So we have to be very careful when we talk about that. Talk about assimilation and forced assimilation, and so on and so forth. But back to Easter and not being pagan. What about the eggs? This is interesting. So eggs were a symbol because of the Lent fast. So eggs being one of the few things you could eat. So eggs became a symbol, and then they also would color them and stuff because they thought it was fun. And then later, as it goes on and goes on and goes on, then we have what it is today. What about the bunny? This is also interesting. I didn't know this until recently. This is a medieval thing. So rabbits became a symbol because of the European brown hare. Just a little side note here. Hares are not rabbits, but most people confuse the two. They look similar, but they're not the same thing. Two different animals. Even more confusing, there's things that are called rabbits in their name that are hares. Like the jackrabbit. Jackrabbit's a hare. It's not a rabbit. I know, confusing, weird. Why do we do this? I don't know. People suck. It's just how it is. We like to confuse ourselves. But the European brown hare became the symbol because it was associated with the Virgin Mary. Why? It's because the brown hare has the ability to reconceive and get a second litter while it's still pregnant with the first. And to them, they thought it was able to conceive asexually or conceive on its own. And they were like, oh, it's like the Virgin Mary. Not realizing it was just basically using what it had the first time. It had multiple eggs fertilized and was able to just, I can get that second litter and then have it after. Basically putting it in storage and having it later. But so they saw it and compared it to the Virgin Mary. And since can't have Jesus without Mary, and we've always had this fascination with Mary. Not that she shouldn't be respected, but I don't know why people basically worship her. I don't get that. The Catholics being weird. I don't get it. Not that she should be respected and talked about. We should talk more about more women in the Bible. But Mary didn't do much in terms of being a prophet. But she's treated higher than a lot of the prophets. Not that she shouldn't be respected, but I've always just found that weird. I think Mary would find it weird. The fact that they kind of regard her more than they regard Christ, which is very strange because she's just the mother of Jesus. And it's still important, but no one's talking about Joseph. He was his dad. What we were doing, but that's weird. But since they had this symbol that they associate with Mary, they had the rabbits, and then 1,000 years later, we get rabbits with eggs and hiding them around for kids. Similar with Santa. So even though Santa doesn't really have anything to do with Christianity, though there was a Saint Nicholas, but you have a bunch of these old traditions around the world that are very, very similar, with this guy giving presents or killing children for misbehaving, and they kind of combined them into one. Christianity didn't do this. Coca-Cola and Macy's did. And that's why we have Santa Claus. And that's also why he's red, and that's why he loves Coca-Cola and is hanging out with them polar bears. That sounds like that's crazy. That's actually what happened. Before they did that campaign in like the 20s and 30s, we didn't really care about Santa or do much. We still loved Christmas. Christmas was still a big deal, but particularly in America and in England. But the traditions were very different. Christmas trees are older than that tradition of what we call Santa now. And they used to just have ornaments and candles on them. And wow, that's I can't believe that there weren't more cities that burned down when people were putting lit candles on their trees. But that's neither here nor there. But you put all these things together, and then you do something once, and then you don't know what it's going to look like 100 years later. Though it hasn't been 100 years since they've done that yet. But that's why. You ever wondered why Santa Claus and polar bears and stuff are always in those Coca-Cola commercials? Isn't because they just thought Santa was cool. It's because they kind of invented it. Santa existed before that. That is true. Other things like Santa. There's, of course, St. Nicholas, so on and so forth. But modern-day Santa exists because of a campaign with Coca-Cola and Macy's. That's just how that works. Now, that doesn't have anything to do with Christianity. That's just an example of how something done when it's compiled and then 1,000 years later it can look very, very different. The rabbits and the eggs were these symbols that they used during Easter. They had no idea what it was going to become much, much later and how it was going to look very different and have really nothing. They didn't think people eat candy, eggs, and all that. I mean, it had nothing to do. It doesn't even really have anything to do with Lent anymore because we're not thinking about eggs that way. But fun fact, Christmas isn't pagan either. The one that everyone assumes is like the devil's holiday, Halloween. That's a Christian holiday. In fact, it might be like the most Christian holiday, considering it was a holy Christian it was a Christian invention. There are other festivals like it. There, Day of the Dead, all that. But what Halloween is now is very different than how it started. But even down to trick-or-treating, that was a Catholic invention. And dressing up and all that. Catholic, like it's so Catholic. And wasn't really based off of things that came before. Whereas Easter, you have Passover, and even Christmas, though we wanted a day to celebrate the birth of our Lord, there are still festivals that happen around that same time in Judaism. And it's like, well, what if we take from this and kind of build upon that to have our own thing? It's because it's always a renegotiation of the prior festivals. Because of course it is. Why wouldn't we do that when we came from another culture and religion and then made our own thing? We would probably bring our own stuff with us. Of course. But anyway, this was actually supposed to be a shorter episode. It turned into being almost an hour, but we're going to end there. I think that's a good place to end with the whole Easter thing. Kind of lighthearted. And, if I would have went through the whole notes, we'd be here a while, and it would be not lighthearted. But yeah, that's where we're going to end. So we thank y'all all for listening. God bless y'all. I hope y'all have a great day, and we will see y'all in the next one.